I had barely set foot in the main hall of my parents' estate when Jason's voice cut through the air like ice. "Helena, why are you even here? Did you think they'd leave you anything?" he sneered, hands planted firmly on his hips, eyes scanning the room as if I were already invisible. A few family friends stifled chuckles. Others exchanged glances that left me feeling exposed, a spectacle in my own home. It was a comment so casually cruel that the sting was almost invisible, yet it lingered, settling deep in my chest. My existence in that room, my very claim to the family name, was being questioned openly, in front of people I'd grown up trusting. I forced a polite smile, but behind it, my mind raced. Was this disdain just arrogance, or a test of how much I could endure? And then I noticed the side door to the warehouse, half hidden behind the old curtains, whispering a promise of secrets no one else would dare look into. I stepped closer to that side door, feeling the hum of silence around me. A part of me wanted to turn back, to retreat into the safety of invisibility, but another part, quiet, insistent, urged me forward. Could I really let Jason define my worth, or was it time I discovered what my parents had truly left behind? I inhaled slowly, anchoring myself to the only thing that mattered. I was Helena, and no one could write my story for me. Growing up, I had always been the compliant one, the daughter who smiled, nodded, and quietly managed the details everyone else overlooked. Jason, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight, the heir apparent, the one whose word carried weight and whose opinion shaped family decisions. My contributions, coordinating accounts, maintaining records, handling mundane but critical logistics, were invisible, assumed, and rarely acknowledged. Now, standing in the estate, it was painfully clear the world had learned to take Jason seriously and to treat me as an afterthought. Even the staff, who had once been warm toward me, now flinched when I walked past, hesitant as if I might disrupt the hierarchy that favored him. Yet, paradoxically, this invisibility carried a secret advantage. While Jason relied on spectacle and overconfidence, I had quietly accumulated knowledge, inventory lists, property layouts, old keys, and forgotten codes. I understood the estate's architecture in a way he never had to, and in that understanding lay leverage. The problem was he didn't see it. Or perhaps, he thought I wouldn't act. He underestimated me, and that underestimation could be turned into a quiet, inexorable power. But first, I had to navigate the subtle minefield of family hierarchy, public scrutiny, and his palpable disdain, without giving him even the smallest clue that I already held a different kind of advantage. And when I approached the warehouse door, I realized it wasn't just a structure of wood and steel. It might be the first step in reclaiming what he refused to recognize I could possess. The warehouse smelled of dust and disuse, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the subtle way Jason had arranged things before my arrival, files slightly misfiled, locks left with fingerprints visible, and the faintest scuff marks on the floor, traces of someone moving quickly, carelessly, without concern for being observed. He thought he was meticulous, but his arrogance left gaps. Small signs of neglect were scattered throughout the estate, and I noticed them instantly. Emails left unread on shared devices, contracts placed in plain sight, even a ledger missing a cover sheet. Each oversight wasn't enough to be called negligence, but together they formed a pattern. When I mentioned a misplaced delivery schedule in passing, Jason waved it off with a laugh. "It's nothing," he said. But I noticed the flicker in his eyes, the slightest annoyance that someone might be paying attention. That pattern, the casual dismissal of responsibility paired with overconfidence, was the thread I would pull. If I read it right, it could unravel far more than just minor oversights. Yet the warehouse held a secret he didn't anticipate, one I wasn't ready to reveal. As I turned the cold metal handle, my fingers brushing against the textured steel, a thought struck me. What if the true value of this place was something he had never imagined, something beyond the scope of his arrogance? I paused. The vault's door loomed before me, sealed, pristine, and humming with the quiet promise of discovery. Jason's confidence grew with every passing hour, fed by the assumption that I was powerless and uninformed. At the family council meeting, he presented plans for the estate's liquidation with all the flair of a showman, expecting applause. Instead, I sat quietly, noting every misstatement, every overlooked clause, every assumption he made about my ignorance. Helena, you can sit this one out, he said casually, as if my presence were irrelevant. A few relatives laughed lightly, nodding along. But inside, I catalogued each word, each gesture, each dismissive glance. This wasn't humiliation anymore, it was a roadmap. Privately, I walked the estate, observing his interactions with staff, noticing which doors he left unlocked, which files went unattended, which maintenance logs were ignored. Each lapse added clarity to what I already suspected. He had built his empire on the assumption that no one would question him, that no one would care enough to look beneath the surface. Yet outwardly, I remained still, composed, an observer in my own home. My silence was misread as weakness, and that misjudgment was exactly what I needed. Jason would continue to underestimate me, continue to assume I was powerless, and in that growing arrogance, the seeds of my advantage were quietly taking root. By the time he left the room, chest puffed with victory, I already knew where I would start. The warehouse, with its locked vault and forgotten corners, wasn't just a relic. It was the first piece in a game he didn't even know we were playing. After the meeting, subtle questions began to seep from Jason's circle. "Are you sure you understand how these assets work?" one relative asked, voice laced with polite doubt. "It's complicated. Perhaps you should let Jason handle it." Each comment, though casual, was designed to make me second-guess myself. I felt the familiar tug of self-doubt, a shadow that had trailed me for years, but I refused to react outwardly. My hands didn't tremble, my voice didn't waver. Instead, I let the doubt sit beside me, like silent companions I could observe without acknowledging. Even the staff, conditioned to follow Jason, began offering helpful advice in hushed tones. Every suggestion that undermined me, every question that implied I lacked competence, was carefully catalogued in my mind. Each was a breadcrumb showing the path of assumption and arrogance I could exploit later. At night, alone in the dim light of my parents' study, I replayed every interaction, dissecting tone, body language, and the unspoken hierarchy that had elevated him while suppressing me. The more I examined it, the more I saw how he had built his confidence on the insecurities of others. And yet, I remained composed, detached. The gaslighting was subtle, but it was useless against someone who wasn't seeking approval or validation. I was no longer trying to prove my worth. I was silently building the knowledge, patience, and strategy that would allow me to turn every doubt cast upon me into a weapon. When I glanced at the warehouse door across the estate, its lock gleaming in the faint evening light, a new thought took shape. Perhaps Jason's greatest oversight wasn't arrogance. It was assuming I wouldn't notice what he valued most. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the day the estate's legal team brought the initial transfer documents for review. Jason swaggered into the office, briefcase in hand, grinning as if victory had already been declared. "Helena," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "I've handled everything. You don't need to worry about these old files or that dusty warehouse. It's all being cleared out. Junk, really." I glanced at the paperwork, noting the language that labeled assets as miscellaneous, insignificant, scrap in legal terms. He didn't notice my steady gaze, my silent calculations. His overconfidence blinded him to the fact that I understood every clause, every omission, every loophole he had left gaping. Family and staff circled the office, some smirking at what they assumed was my defeat. "See," a cousin whispered. "Helena's finally admitting she's out of her depth." I smiled faintly, letting them believe it. Let them watch as I quietly stepped aside, appearing overwhelmed, unprepared, and powerless. Jason chuckled, sliding a signed copy of the documents toward the paralegal. "There. Done. Easy." He had no idea that in signing without verification, he had handed me not junk, but the vault's true treasure. His triumph was complete, public, visible, and, in everyone else's eyes, irreversible. Yet inside, I felt no panic, no despair. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. The world believed I had lost. The contracts were signed, the labels applied, the judgments made. All that remained was the quiet work of transforming perceived defeat into unshakable advantage. And as I left the office, Jason's laughter echoing behind me, I paused at the threshold of the warehouse. The door's cold steel seemed to hum, as if acknowledging the shift. Whatever waited inside was no longer just a secret, It was my instrument of retribution, lying in plain sight while the world cheered my supposed failure. In the days that followed, I stopped reacting. I no longer flinched at Jason's jokes or the pointed remarks from relatives. I didn't argue, didn't correct, didn't explain. I became the observer, the one everyone assumed was fading, when in truth, I was sharpening. I watched patterns emerge, which staff deferred to him automatically, which files he left unattended, which areas of the estate he ignored in his rush to maintain appearances. Every casual oversight, every whispered suggestion, every moment of arrogance was catalogued with precision. Even Jason's own behavior became predictable. He delighted in showing off decisions he thought were irreversible, yet each display left a trail, tiny, almost invisible, but undeniable if you were paying attention. He believed I was lost in despair. I was, instead, quietly mapping his blind spots. At night, in the dim light of my parents' study, I reviewed old deeds, insurance papers, and inventory lists. The warehouse's locked vault called to me from across the estate, its contents unknown but tantalizing. Its secrecy was both a challenge and an invitation. And as I traced the patterns of neglect and oversight, one truth became clear. The apparent defeat was an illusion. The real advantage belonged to the one who waited, observed, and understood the rules while others celebrated their perceived triumphs. The question that hovered quietly in my mind: how long would it take Jason to unknowingly hand me everything I needed? By now, the threads of Jason's arrogance had become unmistakable. Every decision he made, every casual dismissal, every overconfident assumption revealed a consistent pattern. He prioritized speed over scrutiny, spectacle over substance, and perception over reality. Where others saw chaos, I saw a roadmap. The more I traced his actions, the clearer it became. The vault in the warehouse wasn't just neglected, it was a leverage point, a repository of value he believed inconsequential. He assumed no one would care enough to look, no one would understand its significance. And therein lay his blind spot. At night, I compiled timelines of past oversights, missing contracts, mislabeled assets, gaps in insurance documentation. Each small error formed a constellation, mapping out both his weaknesses and the estate's hidden potential. The irony was delicious. He had built an empire on assumptions, and I had built knowledge in silence. I felt a quiet detachment settle over me. The humiliation, the doubts, even the apparent defeat, they no longer had power. I wasn't reacting emotionally, I was thinking strategically. Observation had given me clarity, and clarity was more powerful than confrontation. And as I approached the warehouse once more, tracing the contours of the vault through memory and floor plans, I realized the full scale of what I had discovered. Jason didn't just underestimate me, he had unknowingly positioned me to gain everything. The real game wasn't about family squabbles or estate inheritance. It was about patience, precision, and the subtle art of waiting for the right moment. The vault's lock gleamed under the dim warehouse lights, and I understood. The stage was set, but the opening move was mine alone. I returned to the warehouse under the guise of curiosity, armed with nothing but a small flashlight and a careful plan. The vault's door loomed before me, its cold metal surface unassuming, yet behind it lay the culmination of years of oversight. I had already pieced together the layout from old keys, floor schematics, and subtle maintenance notes Jason never noticed. Inside, the air was cool and still, almost reverent. There they were, rows of collector cars, each meticulously preserved, each worth more than anyone in the room could guess. The smell of leather, oil, and aged polish was intoxicating, yet I remained composed. This discovery wasn't just wealth, it was leverage, untouchable unless I chose to reveal it. I documented everything: VIN numbers, insurance gaps, prior appraisals, service records. Each piece of evidence strengthened my position, ensuring that when the time came, every claim I made would be unassailable. Even Jason's own legal documents, those he signed with casual arrogance, became tools in my hands. He had handed over the keys to his own oversight, unknowingly binding himself to my advantage. I even found witnesses in the form of service logs, maintenance staff, and old appraisal notes, all of which confirmed the authenticity and value of the collection. None of it was obvious, and none of it could be disputed. The vault's existence was my secret, and it was a fortress of power built on his negligence. As I traced my fingers along the polished hoods, a quiet satisfaction settled over me. Jason's arrogance had created a blind spot so vast that it was almost beautiful in its inevitability. He believed he had eliminated me from the equation, but in reality, he had paved the way for my ultimate control. The only question that remained, when and how would I convert this hidden advantage into irreversible action? I didn't rush. I never rushed. Every step, every conversation, every move was calculated to maintain the illusion of compliance while tightening my control. Jason continued to flaunt his authority, oblivious to the fact that the real leverage lay not in his theatrics, but in the secrets he had ignored. I began drafting legal language, framing documents so that ownership would appear seamless and indisputable. I timed every interaction with lawyers, accountants, and estate staff, ensuring that every question would be answered before it was even asked. My calm exterior became a weapon. The more I appeared disengaged, the more he overreached, revealing further gaps in his oversight. Even in casual conversations, I planted subtle ideas, phrased as questions or observations, that guided others to confirm facts without realizing they were corroborating my strategy. Every witness, every document, every procedural nuance was aligned in my favor. Jason thought he was in control, but his overconfidence blinded him to the architecture of his own undoing. I also mapped the public perception carefully. Friends, family, and staff had already internalized the narrative of my defeat. They would never suspect that I was orchestrating every detail behind the scenes. This allowed me to move unseen, gathering signatures, verifying valuations, and securing the vault's assets in ways he would never notice until it was too late. By the time Jason laughed at what he called Helena's cautious hesitation, I had already ensured that every legal and procedural step had been addressed. The collection, the contracts, and the documentation were all ready. The stage was set for the reversal, but I would wait, because timing, as I had learned, was everything. And as I closed the warehouse door behind me that evening, a subtle thrill ran through me. The very arrogance that had humiliated me had now unwittingly built my path to complete control. The question remained, how long before Jason's own actions delivered the final move into my hands? The same hall where Jason had mocked me now felt different. I entered with measured steps, calm, composed, carrying no outward sign of the plans that had been quietly set into motion. Family and staff glanced up, expecting the familiar hesitance, the usual retreat. They were met with something else entirely, quiet assurance. Jason spotted me first, smirk already forming, unaware that the tables had begun to turn. "So, Helena," he said, voice dripping with condescension, ready to watch me handle everything again. I smiled softly, almost politely, letting the words hang in the air. The hall was full of witnesses, yet my restraint drew more attention than his theatrics ever had. I allowed him the illusion of dominance, giving him space to overreach, to showcase decisions he believed were irreversible. Every signed document, every dismissive gesture, every assumption he had made about my ignorance had been catalogued, verified, and aligned. The warehouse's treasures were already mine in legal terms. The vault's contents, once hidden, now formed the backbone of my unseen power. Family members whispered, exchanging uncertain glances. Some had begun to sense the subtle shift, though none could articulate it yet. I didn't speak of contracts, valuations, or ownership. I simply existed in the room differently, controlled, unshakable, patient. The whole that once amplified my humiliation now amplified the weight of my quiet command. Jason, unaware of the storm forming under the surface, moved forward with all the confidence of a man who believed victory was his by default. But the real game had already begun, and for the first time, he was walking directly into it. The question that lingered in my mind as I observed him, how far would he go before he realized the advantage he had unknowingly surrendered? Jason's arrogance only deepened as he moved through the motions of estate liquidation. He signed more documents without reading them, lectured staff on procedures he barely understood, and openly mocked my cautious approach. Each act, each careless signature, each boastful remark became a piece of evidence I quietly stored. During a routine review of the estate's assets, he dismissed concerns about the warehouse contents, labeling them old junk in front of witnesses. Why waste time verifying every scrap? Helena's already satisfied. Right, he said, laughter spilling into the room. But those witnesses, lawyers, accountants, and even staff, were silently noting his words. Every misstatement, every undervaluation, every assumption of my ignorance built the foundation for his undoing. I observed silently, my composure unshaken. Jason's overconfidence had him exposing himself, detailing precisely what he believed to be true, that the vault's contents were worthless, that contracts could be signed without scrutiny, and that I would never act. Each time he overreached, the legal and procedural traps I had prepared quietly solidified. Every false declaration, every casual dismissal, every condescending remark became a thread in a tapestry that would soon render him powerless. By the time he left the room, laughing at what he thought was his triumph, I held in my hands the very tools of his self-incrimination, signed agreements, witness testimonies, and documented evidence that he had underestimated me completely. The irony was subtle, almost invisible, but it was irreversible. And as I turned back toward the warehouse, the thought struck me clearly. He had built his own undoing with his arrogance, and I only needed to release the truth at the precise moment. The day of the formal transfer arrived quietly, without spectacle. Jason, as always, strode in confident, documents in hand, convinced that the estate's so-called junk had been cleared and the warehouse emptied. I followed behind, calm, measured, my presence understated but deliberate. When the documents were presented, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply produced the complete inventory, with photographs, service records, and appraisals, and laid them before the lawyers. Each car was authenticated, insured, and accounted for, legally and unquestionably mine. Gasps echoed through the room. Jason's confident smirk faltered, replaced by the flicker of disbelief. He leaned over the table, scanning the records, as lawyers and staff confirmed every valuation, every VIN number, every signature. The contracts he had signed, labeling the assets as scrap, were binding. His overconfidence, his failure to verify, had handed me everything without dispute. I spoke only once, my voice steady. Everything has been documented. Every signature, every asset, every valuation is accurate and legally binding. The estate's transfer is complete. There was no triumph in my tone, only clarity, a quiet assertion of truth against the illusion he had built. Family and staff exchanged stunned looks. Jason attempted to speak, to correct, to reclaim authority, but the evidence was absolute, irrefutable. His own words, his own signatures, his own negligence, all had become instruments of accountability. The whole that once amplified my humiliation now held the echo of justice, measured and precise. Jason realized, too late, that he had not just underestimated me, he had engineered his own defeat through arrogance. And as the vault's doors stood silently behind me, containing the treasures he never bothered to inspect, I understood. The game was over, the victory complete, and the power had shifted quietly, irrevocably, into my hands. The aftermath was quiet but absolute. Jason retreated into a storm of embarrassment, his overconfidence now documented and undeniable. Lawyers confirmed the validity of the transfer, insurance policies were updated, and the vault's assets were officially mine. Every legal attempt to contest the documents failed. His overreach had created a shield of unassailable legitimacy around my ownership. Family members, who once whispered doubts about my competence, now regarded me with a cautious respect. Staff and accountants, long attuned to Jason's theatrics, adjusted their allegiance silently. No public speeches, no confrontation, just a clear, irrevocable shift in authority. Even Jason's own counsel, previously confident, now approached with careful restraint. The arrogance that had driven him to dismiss every warning had backfired spectacularly, leaving him without recourse. In the quiet corridors of the estate, I moved freely, fully aware that the balance of power had changed, and that it would remain so. And yet, the victory felt strangely serene. There was no need for celebration, no desire for vengeance beyond the measured justice that had already been enacted. Every signature, every contract, every careful observation had done its work. As I walked past the warehouse, now secured and entirely under my control, the realization settled in. The estate, the vault, and the authority Jason had assumed as his birthright were mine, not by spectacle, but by strategy, patience, and unshakable composure. I stood outside the warehouse one last time, the winter sun casting a pale glow across the estate. The cars inside gleamed silently, witnesses to patience, precision, and careful observation. No one else could see the work it had taken, the quiet calculations, the meticulous documentation, the restraint that had allowed the outcome to unfold naturally. Jason did not approach. His arrogance had been replaced by a hesitant, almost cautious silence. The lesson had been delivered without fanfare, without spectacle. Justice had been earned quietly, irrevocably, through timing and understanding rather than force or noise. I locked the doors of the vault, the keys cold and solid in my hand. This wasn't about revenge. It was about equilibrium. Everything that had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated had now been accounted for, legally and irreversibly. The estate, the assets, the authority, it was all mine, secure by observation, patience, and calm resolve. As I walked away, the faintest smile touched my lips. No speeches were necessary. No one needed to witness the satisfaction. The quiet certainty of knowing the truth, and the knowledge that it could never be taken from me, was enough. For the first time in years, I felt entirely, unquestionably, in control. And in that stillness, I realized, some victories are silent, and that is precisely what makes them absolute.